The house felt different the morning after that dinner, as if the walls themselves had stepped back from me. For 32 years, every corner of that place had been filled with Noel's quiet routines. The soft clink of his coffee mug at 6 in the morning, the creak of the back door when he went out to check the garden, the steady rhythm of a man who believed a home should feel safe. Now the silence stretched across the rooms like a cold draft. I woke before sunrise out of habit, reaching across the bed before remembering there was no warm shoulder beside me anymore. My hand touched only the smooth sheet where Noel used to sleep, still faintly smelling of his cedar soap. For a long moment, I simply lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar quiet. When Noel was alive, the house always felt alive too. Pipes hummed softly, the refrigerator clicked on and off, and somewhere in the distance he was always moving, humming under his breath or clearing his throat while reading the newspaper. That morning, every sound seemed too loud because there were so few of them. I finally sat up and pulled on my robe, the same faded blue one Noel had bought me 15 years earlier during a summer trip to Maine. The fabric hung looser now. Grief has a way of taking weight from a person without asking permission. Downstairs, the kitchen looked exactly as it had the night before, except Wade and Romy had already left for work. Their coffee cups were still in the sink, their hurried breakfast plates stacked beside the dishwasher. Not a single note, not a single word asking how I was holding up after burying my husband 1 week earlier. I rinsed their dishes slowly, more out of habit than kindness. For decades I had started my mornings this way, taking care of the small details that make a household run smoothly. But that morning something felt different. Not anger, not even sadness. It was a strange, hollow realization that the life Noel and I built together had quietly moved on without me. After drying my hands, I walked into the living room where the funeral flowers still lined the windowsill. Their scent had begun to turn slightly sour, the petals already curling at the edges. Sympathy bouquets from neighbors, church friends, and a few of Noel's old co-workers. Wade and Romy had not touched them. They had not even removed the ribbon from the large arrangement that read with deepest condolences. I stood there looking at that ribbon for a long time, because the truth was slowly settling into my bones like winter cold. My husband had been gone for 7 days, and already I could feel my place in this house disappearing with him. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like someone erasing a name from a list they had decided no longer mattered. In the days that followed, something in the house began to feel subtly different, the way a familiar room can seem strange when a single piece of furniture has been moved. At first I told myself it was simply grief making everything heavier, but small details started appearing like quiet cracks in a wall. Wade stopped lingering in the kitchen the way he used to. When I entered a room, conversations between him and Romy would soften or end altogether, replaced by polite smiles that never reached their eyes. One morning, I noticed the hallway closet door standing open, several of Noel's old toolboxes missing. Wade said he had moved them to the garage to organize things, yet the garage shelves looked emptier than before, not fuller. Later that afternoon, Romy carried 2 large cardboard boxes down the stairs from the guest room. I asked casually what she was doing, and she replied with a bright, rehearsed tone that she was just decluttering. But the boxes were filled with photo albums and framed pictures from the hallway, things Noel and I had placed there decades ago. I watched her slide them into the trunk of her car as if they were nothing more than outdated decorations. That evening, when I opened the small cabinet in the study where Noel kept important documents, I noticed the combination dial on the safe had been turned slightly. It had always rested at 0. Wade must have opened it. When I asked him if he needed something from inside, he avoided my eyes and said he was only checking insurance papers. His voice sounded calm, but there was a tightness in it that I had never heard when he spoke to me before. Over dinner the next night, I realized something else had changed. They spoke about plans for the house as if I were not sitting right there at the table. Romy mentioned repainting the upstairs bedrooms and converting the den into a nursery someday. Wade nodded thoughtfully, discussing contractors and renovation costs. Not once did either of them ask my opinion, even though every wall in that house had been painted by Noel and me with our own hands. I stirred my soup quietly, listening to them talk about my home as though it already belonged entirely to them. Later, as I walked past the laundry room, I overheard Romy whispering on the phone. Her voice dropped when she noticed my footsteps, but one phrase reached me clearly through the half-closed door. 2 weeks should be enough. Enough for what? I wondered. Enough time for my grief. Enough time to pack my memories into boxes. That night, I sat alone in the living room where Noel used to read the newspaper every evening. The lamp beside his empty chair cast the same warm light it always had, but the room felt colder now. For the first time since the funeral, a quiet realization settled into my chest. Wade and Romy were not simply helping organize the house after a loss. They were rearranging a future that no longer seemed to include me. That night, I did not pack a single box. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed Noel and I had shared for more than 3 decades and let the silence of the house settle around me. The same silence that had followed me since the day we buried him. His reading lamp was still on the nightstand, the shade slightly crooked because he always adjusted it when he read before falling asleep. I reached out and straightened it without thinking, the same small gesture I had done hundreds of times over the years. Noel used to say a house had a memory, that if you listened carefully enough you could hear every laugh and every argument still echoing through the walls. Sitting there that evening, I felt those echoes everywhere. I remembered the first winter after we bought this house when the furnace broke and we slept in the living room under 3 blankets because it was the only place warm enough. Noel had joked that one day we would look back and laugh about how poor we were. We did laugh about it for years. We built everything in that house together piece by piece. He installed the wooden shelves in the hallway himself, even though the instructions confused him. I planted the rose bushes outside the kitchen window because he said he liked seeing flowers when he drank his morning coffee. Every corner of that house carried a story that belonged to both of us. And more than once over the years Noel had taken my hand and said something that now echoed louder than ever in my mind. He used to tell me that no matter what happened I would always be safe there. I can still hear his voice the way it sounded one quiet Sunday afternoon when we were sitting on the back porch watching the sun set behind the maple trees. He squeezed my hand and said softly that the house was our promise to each other. He said it was not just wood and bricks, but the proof that we had built a life together that no one could take away. At the time, I believed him completely. Noel was the kind of man who protected his family without making a show of it. When Wade was a boy and came home crying because someone at school had mocked his worn shoes, Noel worked overtime for 2 months just so he could buy our son the pair he wanted. He never complained. He simply did what he believed a husband and father should do. That was the man I had shared my life with. The man who believed loyalty inside a family meant something sacred. Thinking about him that night made the conversation at the dinner table feel even colder. Because if Noel had been sitting in his usual chair across from me, if he had heard the words Romy spoke and seen the way Wade nodded along, the entire room would have changed. Noel would not have raised his voice. He rarely did. But he would have looked at our son with that quiet disappointment that always made Wade straighten his shoulders and rethink whatever foolish thing he had said. The truth was simple and painful. The only reason they felt bold enough to push me out of my own home was because the one person who had always stood beside me was gone. And for the first time since the funeral, I began to wonder whether Noel had anticipated something like this long before I ever did. I sat at the small oak table by the kitchen window long after the house had gone quiet. The same place where I had poured coffee for my husband every morning for 32 years. The sunlight that afternoon fell across the floor in long golden stripes, warm but strangely distant, as if the house itself was unsure whether it still belonged to me. My thoughts kept circling the same painful realization that had been growing clearer since the dinner 2 nights earlier. The whispers, the paperwork they thought I had not noticed, the sudden way my son and his wife spoke about renovations as if the house were already theirs. I had always believed that time would soften people, that family bonds would survive greed and impatience. But that belief was beginning to feel like something fragile I had been carrying alone. The sound of a car door outside broke the silence. A moment later there was a gentle knock at the front door. When I opened it, I found Daniel standing on the porch, my late husband's old friend from the hardware store downtown. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight the way people do when they know they are about to deliver news no one wants to hear. "Myrtle," he said quietly, holding his cap in both hands. "I hope I am not intruding." I invited him inside, and we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where my family had once laughed together. For a few moments he simply looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the framed photograph of my husband above the counter. "Noel loved this house," he said finally. I nodded, unable to speak. Daniel cleared his throat. That is actually why I came. He explained that earlier that morning my son had stopped by the store asking about contractors who specialized in fast property renovations. According to Daniel, my daughter-in-law had been very specific about the timeline. They wanted estimates immediately. The house, they said, needed to be prepared for sale before the end of summer. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. Not shock exactly, but the heavy confirmation of something my heart had already begun to suspect. Daniel watched me carefully, as if waiting for anger or tears, but neither came. Instead, I poured him a cup of coffee and listened while he spoke. I thought you should know, he added quietly. The way they talked about it, it sounded like you would not be living here much longer. Outside the window, the maple tree my husband planted the year our son was born swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. I realized then that the world had not changed overnight. The birds were still singing, the sunlight still warmed the same wooden floorboards, and the house still held every memory we had built together. The only thing that had changed was my understanding of the people who now believed they could quietly erase me from it. I thanked Daniel for telling me the truth. As he left, he paused at the doorway and said something that stayed with me long after his car disappeared down the street. Your husband always said you were stronger than anyone realized. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like the calm moment before a long overdue decision. The next morning the house felt quieter than usual, but something inside me had changed during the night. Grief was still there, heavy and persistent, yet beneath it another feeling had begun to take root. Clarity. I moved through the kitchen slowly, preparing coffee the same way I had every morning for more than 30 years. The old kettle whistled softly. Sunlight crept across the worn oak counter. Noel had installed himself the summer Wade turned 10. I ran my fingers along the edge of the wood and realized something simple. Every corner of this house held my hands in it. My work, my life, my years. And yet somehow they had convinced themselves that I was merely a guest waiting to be asked to leave. I poured the coffee into my favorite mug and sat at the small breakfast table by the window. Outside, the maple tree Noel planted when we first moved here swayed gently in the spring breeze. For decades, I had watched Wade play beneath that tree, first with toy trucks, then with a baseball glove, later with his own children during the holidays. The memories did not make me weak the way Romy probably expected. They made me certain. After finishing my coffee, I stood up and walked through the house slowly, room by room, noticing details I had stopped seeing years ago. The hallway photos. The scratch on the stair railing from when Wade tried riding his skateboard indoors. The faint mark on the wall where Noel once missed a nail while hanging Christmas lights. These were not the traces of someone who had simply been living here. These were the fingerprints of a life built brick by brick. When I reached the study, I paused at Noel's old desk. His leather chair still faced the window exactly the way he liked it. For a moment my chest tightened, but instead of crying, I opened the bottom drawer where he kept our documents. Insurance papers, property records, bank statements, things we had organized together years ago but rarely looked at. I had never cared much about the paperwork while he was alive. Noel handled most of it with quiet confidence. But that morning I sat down and began reading carefully, page after page, slowly, patiently. The more I read, the steadier I felt. Romy believed she had cornered a grieving widow who would quietly pack her belongings and disappear into some retirement apartment. Wade believed the same thing, though he did not say it out loud. They both mistook silence for surrender. By the time the clock on the wall struck noon, I closed the folder and leaned back in Noel's chair. My hands were no longer trembling. Outside I heard Romy's car pulling into the driveway. Her voice floated through the open front door as she stepped inside, already speaking loudly into her phone about paint colors and renovation plans. Renovation plans for a house she believed would soon belong entirely to her. I folded my hands calmly on the desk and listened. For the first time since that humiliating dinner, I felt something almost peaceful settle in my chest. They thought the next 2 weeks would be about my departure. In reality, those 2 weeks were going to reveal exactly who truly understood this house, this family, and the quiet woman they had both underestimated. The next morning I woke before the sun, the house still wrapped in that strange quiet that had settled over it since Noel passed away. For 32 years this kitchen had been the center of our life together. Coffee brewing at 6, the newspaper spread across the table, Noelle humming softly while butter melted on toast. Now the only sound was the slow ticking of the clock above the stove. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the same chair I had occupied every morning for decades. Romy and Wade were still asleep upstairs, unaware that I had barely closed my eyes all night. Their words from the evening before kept replaying in my mind, sharp and cold. 2 weeks. Pack your bags. This house is mine now. At 71 years old, I had learned something important about cruelty. The loud kind was easy to recognize, but the quiet kind, the kind delivered with calm voices over a family dinner table, that was the most dangerous of all. I sipped the coffee slowly and let my thoughts settle into something clearer. Grief had clouded my mind for days, but this morning the fog was lifting. Noelle had never been careless about our future. My husband was the kind of man who labeled every folder, kept every receipt, and reviewed every document twice. The idea that he would leave me unprotected in my own home did not fit the man I had shared a life with. That thought alone was enough to pull me to my feet. I walked down the hallway toward Noelle's study, a room Wade rarely entered and Romy had always called boring. To me it had always felt like the quiet brain of the house. The desk still looked exactly as Noelle had left it, papers neatly stacked, pens aligned beside his leather planner. For a moment I stood there with my hand resting on the back of his chair, breathing in the faint scent of the cedar polish he liked to use. Then I sat down and opened the bottom drawer. Inside were the folders Noelle had organized for years, each one labeled in his careful handwriting. Insurance, property taxes, mortgage records. My fingers moved slowly across them until I reached the folder marked Simply Estate Documents. When I lifted it out, something inside me felt steady for the first time since the funeral. I carried the folder back to the kitchen table and opened it beside my coffee. Wade and Romy believed grief had made me weak. They believed the quiet widow downstairs was too broken to question anything they said. Perhaps that was why they had been so careless with their confidence. I turned the first page slowly, letting my eyes move across Noelle's familiar signature at the bottom of the document. Outside, the early morning light began to spill through the window above the sink, filling the kitchen with pale gold. For the first time since that dinner, I felt something other than sadness. It was not anger either. It was something calmer, something colder. Because as I continued reading, one thing became very clear. My son and his wife had made a very serious mistake. I did not argue with them that night. There was no point. People who have already decided what you are worth rarely change their minds because of words. Instead, I did something far quieter. I began to observe. The next morning the house felt different, not because Noelle was gone, but because I finally saw the people living inside it clearly. Wade left early for work, barely touching the coffee I had brewed out of habit. Romy stood in the kitchen scrolling through listings on her tablet, speaking on the phone with a cheerful tone she had never once used with me. I heard phrases like renovation potential and perfect for a young family, and the number she mentioned for the asking price made something cold settle in my chest. They were already planning the future of this house, my house, as if I had already vanished from it. I washed the breakfast dishes slowly, listening without letting them know I understood exactly what was happening. For 32 years Noelle and I had built this place piece by piece. We had planted the maple tree in the front yard when Wade was 10 years old. We had painted the living room 3 different shades before finding the one that made the afternoon light look warm. Every corner of this house held a memory, and now my son and his wife were discussing it the way real estate agents talk about square footage. Later that afternoon, I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest at the foot of our bed. Inside were the things Noelle had always insisted we keep safe. Old letters, insurance papers, property documents, and the small leather folder he once jokingly called our quiet protection plan. I had never paid much attention to it before because Noelle handled those matters with calm certainty. But as I sat there reading through the papers one by one, something surprising happened. The helpless grief that had followed me all week began to thin, replaced by a slow, steady clarity. My husband had not been careless. In fact, Noelle had been remarkably precise about certain things. By the time the afternoon sun shifted across the bedroom floor, I understood far more about our situation than Wade and Romy apparently did. I closed the folder gently and returned it to the chest. When I came downstairs, Romy was measuring the dining room wall with a tape measure, already imagining where her new furniture would go. She glanced at me briefly and then continued her work as if I were just another piece of old decor, still waiting to be removed. I simply nodded to myself and walked past her toward the back porch. The autumn air was cool and quiet, and the maple tree Noelle planted decades ago rustled softly in the wind. For the first time since that dinner, I felt something stronger than sadness. They believed the story was already finished. They believed I would quietly pack my things and disappear within 2 weeks. I leaned against the porch railing and watched the sunlight move across the yard we had cared for together for so many years. Let them believe that, I thought. Sometimes the greatest advantage a person can have is being underestimated. I did not sleep much that night. The house felt different after that dinner, as if the walls themselves had heard what was said and were quietly waiting to see what I would do next. At 71 years old, grief had already taken my husband, but something else had woken up inside me during that humiliating conversation at the table. It was not anger exactly. It was clarity, the kind that comes when illusions finally fall away. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the way I used to when Noelle and I would prepare for long road trips together. The air in the kitchen was cool and still. I brewed coffee the same way I had for 30 years, measuring the grounds carefully, listening to the familiar drip of the machine. Upstairs, Wade and Romy were still asleep, unaware that the woman they believed was helpless had already begun to move. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began writing down everything I remembered. Dates, conversations, documents Noelle had mentioned over the years. My husband had never been careless with money or property. That was one of the many things I loved about him. He believed in preparation. Life changes fast, he used to say while organizing files in his study. And when it does, you should already know where you stand. As the sun slowly rose through the kitchen window, illuminating the backyard Noelle had planted with his own hands, I realized something important. Wade and Romy had assumed that once Noelle died, the foundation of this house would collapse with him. They believed the quiet woman who cooked Sunday dinners and mailed birthday cards was too soft to question anything, too old to fight back, too heartbroken to think clearly. That assumption would turn out to be their biggest mistake. By 8 o'clock, I had dressed carefully in a navy sweater and pressed slacks. I brushed my silver hair and applied a small touch of lipstick, the way my mother taught me decades ago. When I looked in the hallway mirror, the woman staring back did not look defeated. She looked composed, focused, ready. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. Just as I was about to leave, Wade appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing his eyes like a tired teenager instead of a 43-year-old man. "Where are you going this early, Mom?" he asked, his voice still heavy with sleep. I paused only long enough to meet his gaze. "I have a few errands," I replied calmly. "Things your father asked me to take care of someday." Wade frowned slightly, clearly not understanding what I meant, but he did not ask any more questions. And that was fine with me. Some answers were better delivered all at once. As I stepped outside into the cool morning air, I felt something settle firmly in my chest. For the first time since Noelle's funeral, I was not walking away from my life. I was walking toward the truth my husband had carefully protected for years. And very soon, my son and his wife were going to discover that the story they thought they controlled was only just beginning. The morning of the meeting arrived with a strange kind of calm that I had not felt in months. The sky outside the courthouse was pale and quiet, the kind of soft gray that made the whole town feel slower than usual. I parked my old sedan across the street and sat there for a moment, watching people walk past with coffee cups and briefcases, each one busy with lives that had nothing to do with the small storm about to unfold inside that building. 2 weeks earlier, I had walked out of my own home carrying nothing but a suitcase and 32 years of memories. Wade had watched from the doorway with that same distant expression, and Romy had already started measuring the living room for new furniture before my car even left the driveway. But today was different. Today I was not the woman they believed they had erased. When I stepped into the courthouse lobby, I saw them immediately. Wade stood near the reception desk in a navy suit he rarely wore, his shoulders stiff with nervous energy. Romy was beside him, scrolling through her phone with that confident half-smile she always used when she thought she had already won. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. I studied them quietly the way one studies strangers in an airport. It was strange how distance could change the way you saw your own family. Wade looked older than I remembered, the lines around his mouth deeper, his posture less certain. Romy, on the other hand, looked perfectly composed, her blonde hair pulled into a neat twist, her pearl earrings catching the overhead light. She finally glanced up and froze when she saw me walking toward them. I expected anger or maybe embarrassment. Instead, I saw confusion flicker across her face. "Mom," Wade said after a long pause, as if the word felt unfamiliar now. I nodded politely. "Good morning, Wade." "Romy." My voice sounded steady, almost detached, the way it does when you speak during a business appointment rather than a family conversation. Romy crossed her arms. "I did not think you needed to be here today. This is about the property transfer paperwork." I allowed myself the smallest smile. "Yes, I know exactly what it is about. The attorney will explain everything in a moment." Wade frowned slightly. "Mom, we already talked about this. Dad left the house to me. You were living there, but legally it belongs to the estate." I listened without interrupting, the same patient silence I had practiced for weeks. Then the courtroom door opened, and Mr. Harrison stepped into the hallway holding a thin leather folder. His eyes moved from Wade to Romy and finally rested on me with a quiet nod of reassurance. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "we are ready for you." Romy straightened immediately. "Perfect," she said briskly. "The sooner we finalize this, the sooner we can move forward." But Mr. Harrison did not gesture toward them. He held the door open and looked directly at me. "After you, Mrs. Carter." The silence that followed felt heavy and unfamiliar. I walked past my son and his wife without hurrying, feeling their confusion behind me like a shift in the air. For the first time since Noelle died, I felt something return to my chest that had been missing for weeks. Not anger, not revenge, something steadier than that. The quiet certainty that the story they had written about me was about to be corrected. The following week unfolded with a strange, almost surreal calm that I had not felt since before Noelle died. For the first time since that humiliating dinner, I was no longer reacting to what Wade and Romy decided for my life. Instead, I was watching events move quietly in the direction I had already set in motion. On a gray Tuesday morning, I sat in a small office across from Mr. Henderson, the attorney who had handled Noelle's legal affairs for nearly 20 years. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, the kind of place where careful decisions had shaped many families' futures. He slid a folder across the desk toward me with a measured expression. "Everything is ready, Mrs. Callahan," he said. "The documents will be filed tomorrow morning." I rested my hands on the folder, but did not open it right away. Outside the window, traffic moved slowly along the street, ordinary people going about their lives without any idea how much could change in a single week. It still amazed me how certain Wade and Romy had been that night at the dinner table. Their confidence had come from one simple assumption, that I was powerless without my husband. They believed grief would make me weak, that loneliness would make me obedient. They had forgotten something important about the woman who spent 32 years building a life beside Noelle. I had not simply lived in that house. I had built it, protected it, and understood every decision tied to it. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat gently, bringing my attention back to the present. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "He anticipated complications." A faint, bittersweet smile crossed my face. That sounded exactly like Noelle. Even in his final months, when illness had begun to slow him down, he had remained the most careful planner I had ever known. He believed in preparing quietly rather than arguing loudly. I finally opened the folder. The papers inside were precise, formal, and unmistakably clear. Ownership records, legal transfers, instructions that had been signed months before his heart gave out in the quiet hours of a Sunday morning. Wade had looked so certain when he said the house belonged to him now. I remembered the way Romy leaned back in her chair with that satisfied little smile, already imagining new furniture and nursery colors for the rooms upstairs. They had already begun dividing my life as if I were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Mr. Henderson folded his hands. "Once these are filed, the situation will become very clear to everyone involved." I closed the folder slowly and looked at him. For the first time since Noelle's funeral, I felt something settle inside my chest. Not anger, not revenge, just a quiet sense of balance returning to a world that had tilted dangerously out of place. "Thank you," I said. When I stepped outside the office, the afternoon air felt crisp and clean. My phone buzzed in my purse just as I reached the sidewalk. Wade's name lit up the screen. I watched it ring for a moment before answering. His voice came through with forced politeness. "Mom, Romy and I were wondering if you had made any progress with moving your things. There was a pause while I looked down the street at the slow line of passing cars. Yes, wait, I said calmly. Everything is moving exactly as it should. Neither of them understood yet what that truly meant. But by tomorrow morning, they would. The morning air felt different the day everything finally settled. Not lighter exactly, but clearer, like a window that had been opened after months of stale silence. I stood on the small wooden porch of the lake house, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, watching the sun climb slowly over the water. For the first time in many months, my breathing felt steady. The world had not ended when I walked away from that dining room table. In fact, it had quietly rearranged itself. Word travels fast in families, especially when pride is involved. Within a week, distant relatives had heard the story, though every version seemed to twist itself depending on who told it. Some said Wade had made a terrible mistake. Others whispered that Romy had pushed too far. None of it mattered much to me anymore. The truth was already written in documents, signatures, and the calm decisions I had made when everyone else assumed I was too broken to think clearly. The house they had tried to claim was no longer part of their future. I had sold it months earlier through an arrangement Noel, and I had quietly prepared long before his passing. The property had been transferred into a trust, and the proceeds now funded the quiet life I was living beside the lake, where the mornings were peaceful and the nights were filled with the soft sound of water against the dock. Wade eventually called. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered, as if the years between us had suddenly become very real to him. He tried to explain, to soften what had happened, to say that things had gotten complicated. I listened politely. I did not interrupt. When he finished, there was a long pause on the line, the kind that once would have made me rush to comfort him. But that version of me had quietly stepped aside. I told him I hoped he and his wife would build the life they wanted. I said I wished them well. And then I ended the call. It was not anger that guided me. It was clarity. For decades I had believed that being a mother meant enduring everything, forgiving everything, sacrificing everything. But age has a way of revealing truths that youth hides. Respect is not something you beg for from your own family. It is something they either give freely or lose the privilege to receive from you. Later that afternoon, I walked down to the edge of the dock. The water reflected the wide American sky in shades of silver and blue. Somewhere across the lake a small boat drifted lazily, its engine humming softly. I thought about Noel then, about the quiet promises we had made to each other over 32 years of marriage. He had always told me that strength did not mean shouting the loudest in the room. Sometimes it meant standing up quietly and walking toward a better life. I smiled to myself as the breeze moved across the water. They had believed I was leaving with nothing but grief. What they never understood was that I was also leaving with freedom. And at 71 years old, that was more valuable than any house they could have taken from me. The house felt strangely quiet the morning after everything finally settled. Not the heavy silence that used to sit in my chest during those first weeks after Noel passed away, but a calmer kind of quiet, the kind that comes when a long storm finally moves past the horizon. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window and rested gently across the old oak table where I had spent so many years cooking meals for people who once called this place home. For the first time in a long while, I sat there without feeling like a guest in my own life. I poured myself a cup of coffee and listened to the simple sounds around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock above the stove, the distant rustle of leaves outside. It was the same house, the same walls, the same memories, but something inside me had changed. The woman who had once sat at that table hoping her son would look at her with kindness no longer existed. In her place was someone quieter, steadier, someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to belong. I thought about Wade and Romy, about the way they had looked when everything they believed they controlled slipped quietly out of their hands. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had simply allowed the truth to unfold in its own calm, undeniable way. Some people believe justice has to be loud to matter. I have learned that the most powerful moments often arrive without a single shout. They arrive in silence, in documents signed long ago, in decisions made with patience instead of anger. I stood and walked slowly through the living room, my fingers brushing the back of the armchair Noel used to sit in every evening while reading the newspaper. For a moment, I could almost picture him there again, his glasses low on his nose, his voice warm as he asked what I wanted for dinner. He had always believed I was stronger than I knew. Back then I thought he was just being kind. Now I understood he had simply seen the truth before I did. I paused near the window and looked out at the backyard where the maple tree we planted 30 years ago stretched its branches toward the pale morning sky. Seasons had come and gone around that tree. Children had grown up. Promises had been made and broken. Yet the roots beneath the soil held steady through every storm. In many ways, that was what my life felt like now. The surface had been shaken, but the foundation remained strong. I did not know what Wade and Romy would choose to do next. That was no longer my burden to carry. My story was no longer tied to their approval, their plans, or their expectations. For the first time since Noelle's funeral, I opened the back door and stepped outside, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. The future did not look frightening anymore. It looked wide, quiet, and entirely my own.